Good afternoon to everyone in India, and a very warm welcome to a webinar on SEL for Heads. It is after many months that we are hosting a webinar for school heads, and the moment feels the most opportune as social and emotional learning, SEL in short, for children is picking momentum in all corners of our country, India. The pandemic has also brought emphasis to well-being of teachers in order to sustain a healthy environment in school. However, what remains slightly or underexplored is the state of the ones who are making these decisions, planning these initiatives, along with the million other tasks in school. Today, the session is dedicated to all of you who have taken on the influential yet demanding role in your school, of that of being a head or a coordinator or a head teacher. And very soon you will find out why we are here and why are we laying so much emphasis on your well-being and mental health. But before that, I invite you all to participate in a short Zoom poll, which my colleague Swapnil will be sharing soon. It is a very short one, and I request all of you to be as honest as you can and just choose the answer that comes to your mind first. So, Swapnil, can you just share the quick Zoom poll? I hope you all can see it on your screens. There are about 8 statements, and you can select only one answer. So yes, the questions as simple as they sound and the answers as difficult as they might be. But as the head, do you feel that you are responsible for overall performance of your school? Majority, 67% say a yes. Need to solve every problem that teachers or parents bring to you. 54% say yes. Should be the person that your teachers can fall back upon. 64% say yes. Must appear calm and collected in face of any crisis. 92% say yes. Must prioritize your school and your department over other things in life. So here, surprisingly, 64% say a no, while 36% say yes. Must rise above making mistakes because others look up to you. 62% say a yes. Must be formal with other teachers as they might take you casually. 59% say yes. Are responsible for the school's reputation and student enrollment every year. 85% say yes. I invite your reactions here, and it would be wonderful if you all can, type out a few words or just express yourselves in the chat box. How do you feel when you see these results? What does it evoke inside you? It would be wonderful if some of you can just quickly type out a few reactions, or you can use the reactions option also, but it would be wonderful to listen to you in the chat box. I hear someone telling me that my voice is breaking. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Yeah.
Now you are, because there's somebody's audio that was on. I just muted.
Yes. So a few housekeeping rules. Let us all keep our audios off, stay on mute, and it would be wonderful to have the cameras on. It's always wonderful to see faces. Yes, so some of you have already started typing. Most of us think in the same way. Yes, there is sort of agreement, in terms of what the job really demands and what is expected of you in school. So quickly moving ahead from here. So while the head is expected to do so many things, and most importantly, always stay calm and cool in face of crisis, to listen to your teachers, listen to the parents, also listen to your, to the management, to the other stakeholders in the school, Recently, I met a group of teachers, and they very warmly, referred to their head as a mother figure. A head is someone that they just run to for in SOS situation. When nothing works in the class and when they are almost breaking down, it is the head who kind of, really offers support or makes them feel that all is well, all is in control. So it is, but the poll also shows that it is a very tough job. It is very demanding, and to stay like this days on days consistently can have a lot of repercussions on your own health, on your own well-being. And then are we really giving attention to that? So while the head is expected to build character, inspire dreams, encourage creativity, support colleagues, and pave way for better quality and higher standards, it is important to make a quick check-in and find out how is the heart of the head doing. So, to that purpose, I invite Maya, the founder director of the Teacher Foundation, to introduce our guest today and to also set the context for today's meeting this afternoon. So, a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Teacher Foundation. Over to you, Maya.
Thanks, Manala. Hello once again from my side, on behalf of the Teacher Foundation. Welcome to our June HeadsNet webinar, SEL for Head Teachers. We are delighted to feature today James Pope, a former head teacher and founder director of the UK-based organization Inspire Educate Private Limited. James is someone who has himself faced many challenges as the head of a secondary school in Gloucestershire in the UK. Funding cuts, limited resources, and of course the intense pressure from UK government's Office for Standards in Education, Ofsted, on raising enrollments and improving pupils' learning outcomes. So these are some of these challenges we in India may not directly face, especially the private schools, but we are familiar with many of these challenges. So this experience that James had, along with the many similar experiences that other head teacher colleagues in the UK have had, led James to found Inspire Educate. Inspire Educate's website shares its objectives, and these are the objectives: to celebrate the excellence within the education system, recognizing the work of individuals and groups to deliver a high-quality education to our children, to pursue and drive change in our education system, to provide high-quality support for school leaders. One important initiative of Inspire Educate is HeadsUp4HTs that offers coaching and mentoring to school heads. This is an initiative that deeply resonates with TTF's own mission: every teacher and head teacher more enabled, more inspired. According to the UK's prestigious Times Educational Supplement, TES, 9 out of 10 school leaders suffer poor mental health. We as yet don't have any similar data in India. However, TTF conducted a very brief survey of registered participants on this webinar. Some 300 people had registered. I don't know how many will turn up today. We will share the results before we close today's session, not just yet. It's odd that usually in education, things are always so top-down. The government says something, the Department of Education says something, then it comes into schools. But in mental well-being, still a relatively new idea for Indian education, it seems to be bottom-up. We're just beginning to consider the social, emotional health and well-being of children, of our pupils and teachers. We now need to urgently consider school leadership's well-being, mental health and well-being too. And so it's time to extend a very warm welcome to our featured speaker, James Pope. Over to you, James.
Maya, thank you ever so much for that very warm welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to present to you all this morning for me, this afternoon for all of you. It's a real pleasure and a privilege. I'm just going to pause slightly while I share my screen. So hopefully you can see my presentation. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes, awesome stuff. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the warm introduction, Maya. And I say it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So I'm going to talk to you today about intentional and sustainable support for leaders. It's really interesting listening to Maya talk about the survey that was done for people signing up for this webinar, but also to look at the poll results for the questions that you responded to at the beginning of this session. But I'm always slightly wary about percentages when we're looking at percentages. I'm always slightly wary about percentage results, because we mustn't forget that although things may look positive in some of the answers, the percentages look quite positive. We've still got a proportion of people who perhaps answering in the negative. And we must remember that the percentage that shows, that percentage is made up of individual human beings. And that really does drive the work that we do both at HeadsUp4HeadTeachers and also Core Coaching Group International. It's interesting, during the pandemic, there were surveys done of head teachers in England during the first year of the pandemic in England. And at various points, an organisation called TeacherTap had surveyed the well-being of head teachers in England. And before the pandemic, the responses used to be around about 87%. They fall in line roughly with the figures that Maya's just shared from the TES, the Times Education Supplements. Around 87% of head teachers said that they felt that their anxiety and stress levels were under control. And that looks really positive. You think 87%, that's absolutely fantastic. However, 13% of the remainder said that they didn't feel as if their anxiety and stress was under control. And whilst that may feel like a small percentage, that actually equates to 3,600 individual head teachers who were struggling with their anxiety and stress. And that really is one of the drivers for us at HeadsUp4HeadTeachers and Core Coaching Group International, is actually, can we support those leaders? Can we support those leaders to manage that anxiety and stress? And that is very much the work that we do and the work that we undertake. So let me talk a little bit about who we are. So HeadsUp4HeadTeachers first is a network in England that was started 4 years ago. Maya's given a bit of an introduction as to where that came from. So it stemmed out of my organisation, Inspire Educate. That network now has 10,000 people in it. They're not all from England. We do have people internationally joining our network. So it has 10,000 people in it. And HeadsUp4HeadTeachers has actively supported the well-being of about 3,500 head teachers in the English education system. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that works and how that operates during this presentation. Core Coaching Group International is not an educational organisation. As the name suggests, it focuses very much on coaching. So whereas HeadsUp4HeadTeachers focuses on creating peer networks of support, Core Coaching Group International focuses much more on putting a coaching toolkit in every individual. And Core Coaching Group, as the name suggests, is an international organisation, is working in England, but it also works across the world, in the States and in Australia and various other regions of the world, and is very much focused on our passion at Core Coaching Group International is, can we give everybody the positive psychology toolkit and the coaching toolkit where they can coach themselves and each other through issues that they may be facing in their professional life or in their personal life. So that they are both network organizations. They both very much rely upon the skill of the people who are within the network. I'll touch upon that a little bit further as we go through the presentation. So I've touched a little bit on the landscape in England, but I guess this next bit is very much about context. And what I'm interested in is this is what we get back from the English education system. This is what we hear back from people. I guess what I'm interested in is which bits of this resonate with you. So towards the end of this presentation, there'll be the opportunity for you to ask some questions in the chat. Please do that as you're going through. If I say anything that resonates with you or makes you reflect or raises a question, please do pop that in the chat, and we will try and answer and respond to those questions at the end of the presentation. But that's really the basis for this presentation, is that the things that we're seeing in England and in the education system in England resonate with what you're feeling. And on the basis of the poll and the survey that you've already completed, my gut instinct is yes, there is a bit of resonance. There is a similarity in the issues that head teachers in India are grappling with the issues that head teachers in England are grappling with, specifically focused on well-being and their personal well-being. So let's talk a little bit about the landscape in England. Heads Up for Head Teachers is very much focused on two issues that are increasingly difficult issues in the English education system. The first one is to do with the recruitment of head teachers into the English education system, and all of the stats and data on this screen come from the National Association of Head Teachers in England, which represents a large majority of the primary school head teachers in the English education system, so some 18,000, 19,000 people. And you can see from the screen there that from a recruitment point of view, we have a real issue in England, and it was an issue that started before the pandemic, but the pandemic has amplified and made the issue worse. So we only have about half of our deputy head teachers and assistant head teachers. 47% of them are saying that they would aspire to headship. 53% of them are saying that they would not. That is a real issue and a concern. And of the remaining fifth, 23 of them are undecided. So of that 47%, only actually a smaller number of those are saying yes, they are definitely thinking about headship. I was presenting last Friday to a group of head teachers in Islington in London. And I asked those deputy head teachers, asked how many of those were thinking of applying for headship. And out of a room with 40 people in it, only 2 people put their hands up. So recruitment, our pipeline of new leaders is a real concern in the English education system. We also find that from a recruitment point of view that we've got dissatisfaction in the English education system is steeply on the rise. We know that if people are dissatisfied, then they are unlikely to step into the leadership space. And so we can see that only a third of leaders would recommend school leadership as a career goal. And that has changed dramatically over the course of the last year. And then we have the pressures of driving mental health concerns and worries for school leaders. And we can see that the figures for both middle leaders, so for us, that would be heads of department and heads of faculty and heads of year in the English education system, and also as senior leadership teams, we can see the figures there are worryingly high for the number of head teachers who feel that they've had to, leaders who feel that they've had to access mental health and wellbeing support over the last year. What it's important to say is where they are accessing mental health and wellbeing support, it is not systemised in England. It is very hit and miss. It is very much down to whether your school has the money to support you in accessing that support. And one of the campaign drivers for Heads Up for Head Teachers is actually recognising that there are mental health and wellbeing issues for school leaders in the English education system. Can we be much better at being systemist and creating systems of support, which is very much what the Heads Up for Head Teachers community does. Then we look at retention. So recruitment, what's our pipeline of head teachers looking like? We then look at the other side of the coin. So, okay, what's happening for those head teachers who have stepped into the space? And again, these are figures from a survey that was done through the NAHT about 18 months, 2 years ago. And again, you can see that the figures are worrying. So 20% of primary school head teachers leave their job in the first 5 years. And that, that equates to a significant proportion. That equates to a good 3,000 or 4,000 head teachers that have trained, have stepped into the space of school leadership, and then have decided in their first 5 years of headship that they don't want to carry on in the job. And we get similar figures of around 30% of secondary school leaders saying the same things, so stepping out of this space. So within the English education system, we've got a big issue with both the recruitment and retention of school leaders. Let's look at some of the drivers for that. So this is what happens when we survey head teachers within the Heads Up for Head Teachers community. And it's really interesting when we look at some of these things that I will explain, is that what head teachers are not saying is they're not talking about the technical aspects of their role. They're not talking about the technical aspects of being a head teacher. The things that they say that they are grappling with are these things which are much more fundamental to human behaviour. So the things that they will talk about when we survey, so our head teachers will talk about this sense of isolation. I'd be really interested if these 5 things resonate with you. So if they do, please do pop it into the chat. So headship, school leadership is the most wonderful job in the world. It's an absolute privilege to be a school leader. And one of the things that's unique about it is that you're surrounded by people every single day, your staff, your children, the parents and the community. And yet when it comes to decision-making authority and the burden of decision-making, what our head teachers in England are saying is that often leaves them feeling quite isolated, that the accountability that comes with that decision-making can leave them feeling quite isolated. Second thing that our head teachers will talk about is this notion of imposter syndrome. So a real desire to do the job and a real passion for education and school leadership, but this nagging sense in the back of their heads about whether they are good enough to do the job or not. So this, we call that imposter syndrome. It may be a term that is familiar to you, but it's this notion that actually I feel like an imposter because the demand is so high on me that I don't feel that every day I am doing a good enough job. And I worry that, you know, head teachers will talk about being found out, that they can't do a good enough job, which is completely counter to what we see in our schools, that they are doing an absolutely wonderful job. But that inner dialogue that we have with ourselves, that questioning and self-reflection, which can be a strength, when it spirals out of control and becomes imposter syndrome, becomes a bit more problematic. The head teachers in England will then also talk about this notion of competition. It's partly driven by the accountability system in England, but it's also driven by the performance tables and this notion that, you know, I'm not as good as the school down the road. I'm not as good as the school that's in the next town. I'm not as good as the school in the next city. And that really does play on head teachers' minds and really does affect their mental health and well-being. Well, I'm not going to go into detail about the accountability system in England. I think it's very different in India, but in the English accountability system, Ofsted, which is the regulatory body for performance of schools in the English education system, creates this culture of very high stakes accountability for head teachers. And heads are really conscious of the need to be accountable for the way that they spend the money and the way that they run the schools and the outcomes that they get for young people. But the thing that they find very, very tricky is that notion that you're constantly walking along a cliff edge, and actually something could happen in your school community and you could get blown off that cliff at any moment. And that becomes a real pressure. And those four things all combine then to impact on both the professional and personal relationships and well-being of head teachers. So those are the things that our head teachers are saying. As I say, I'd be really interested if any of those things resonate with you. If you pop those into the chat, that would be interesting to ask any questions around. And then, of course, we've had a pandemic, global pandemic with COVID, and what that has created is an amplification for lots of our head teachers. They were saying this before the pandemic. What we found after the pandemic is, for many of our head teachers, they found that sense of isolation and imposter syndrome and competition and high stakes accountability and the impact on their relationships and their well-being has all been amplified by the pandemic that everybody has experienced. So let's talk about some key terms in terms of, okay, well, that's the landscape, that's what we're dealing with. So broadly, a worryingly low number of people want to step into school leadership. A high number of people are stepping out of school leadership once they have. And we've got these drivers that are creating a very low sense of, or very high sense of anxiety and stress amongst the school leaders that we have. And that comes through in our polling. So one of the things that we're really passionate about is this notion of, can we be much more intentional about how we support our school leaders? And if we're going to be intentional, we have to take two things into account. We have to take into account this one, the fact that actually it's a joyful thing to be a school leader. It's a joyful thing to be a head teacher. It's an enormous privilege actually to be a head. I always felt the privilege when I was a head teacher. I always felt the absolute privilege of leading a community. And it is absolutely fine that we can sit there and we can say, do you know what? I love my job. I love being a head teacher. It's joyful and it's a real privilege, because it is. We don't always see it, we don't always recognize it, and that's part of the work that we do, is to help leaders see the joy in their job. Okay, but it is also okay to say this. So it's also okay to say that it is really challenging. What we tend to find in England is we get Jim Collins, who wrote the brilliant book, Good to Great, which I would recommend to you as something to read about how we can take organizations from being good organizations to being great organizations. He talks about the tyranny of awe, the word awe, O-R. And we do tend to find that when it comes to that feeling of joy and that feeling of challenge in the English education system. People present as either joyful and, yeah, I'm loving my job, or, oh my God, I'm challenged and I'm really anxious and my stress levels are high. And what we say is actually, let's ignore the tyranny of awe and let's talk about the power of and. So actually, it is fine for me as a school leader to say, I love my job, I love doing what I do, and I find it very challenging. And when we accept those two things together, then that takes us into a space of intentionality. We can then go, right, okay, headship is a brilliant job. Headship is a wonderful privilege. but it is a challenging job, and therefore we need to be much better at the way that we support leaders who are stepping into that leadership space. So rather than taking a sink or swim approach, which is seeing many of those leaders step out in the first 5 years of their headship, can we support them from the very beginning of their headship, because we're being intentional, because we recognize it's a joyful job and a privilege, and it's also very challenging. What underpins some of the work that we do is research that was done into post-traumatic stress disorders in the mid-1990s. We use this both at HeadsUp4HTs and also within the core coaching group international community. You'll notice we changed the terminology from post-traumatic stress disorders to post-traumatic growth. That is very much a positive psychology tenet. Is actually, can we take things that are negative that are happening to us and can we turn them into something positive? And essentially what this graph is showing, without going into the detail of it too much, is that basically we all experience adversity in our lives, and we all experience traumatic events in our lives. And traumatic doesn't have to be a big event like the pandemic. It could be something small that's happened to you. It could be a complaint. In England, we get, parental complaint email can feel like a traumatic event. And that traumatic event, as the graph is showing, impacts negatively on our ability to function in our job. So that's the vertical line about a third of the way across the graph. And the point is that we can recover from a traumatic event or an adversity in our working and personal lives in 4 broadly different ways. We can thrive, we can function better after the adverse event if we're supported well, or we can recover back to where we were, which is a demonstration of resilience. Or we survive with impairment. So we have some post-traumatic stress disorders, but we still do our job. We're just not doing it with the same level of functioning that we were before. Or indeed, sadly, and we do see this in the English education system with head teachers stepping out because they succumb to the post-traumatic stress that has been created. I'm showing you that not because that graph's important, although there are clearly some important messages in there, but because of the approaches that we take at core coaching and also HeadsUp4HTs. So HeadsUp4HTs within education with school leaders, core coaching group international across a large number of sectors, not just within education, is actually if we take approaches here, if we provide intentional support at this point, then the reality is people have a much better chance of recovering or indeed thriving after a traumatic event. However, that's not all we're about. That's about helping people to recover, but we're also about putting tools in people's pockets, which means that we can be much more proactive about keeping them at that level of thriving and that level of resilience for when they experience the next traumatic event. So for us, for the support that we offer in England and to leaders in England, and through the core community, through individuals across the globe, is actually, can we be a bit more proactive using positive psychology tools to help people stay in the thriving and the recover and resilience space, so that the next traumatic event doesn't affect them quite as badly. So intentionality is a really important term for us, but a second really important term for us is this notion of sustainability, which is why we're both network organizations. So in network organizations, we have a much better chance of sustaining support because the support comes from within the network rather than top down from people like myself. So sustainability is a really important word for us. The reason why is because alternatives basically are very, very costly. And the reality is once you start paying for support that isn't sustainable, then you have to keep paying for it in the longer term. So because money is not readily available in the English education system, I suspect it's also the same in the Indian education system, is we need to try and keep the costs down. And we can do that through creating peer networks of support in the HeadsUp4HTs community and peer networks of coaching in the core coaching group international. Just whiz past that one. I'm just going to talk about a few steps now, because if we do decide to move together forward in terms of what that intentional wellbeing support looks like, then I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the steps that we use. I'm not going to dwell on these. I'm just going to talk very rapidly about them, but we will explore these in much more depth, both through the HeadsUp4HTs community, but also through the core coaching. You will explore some similar things as well. But these are the things that we do within our HeadsUp4HTs community to address the isolation, the imposter syndrome, the competition, the high stakes accountability, and also the impact on personal and professional well-being and relationships. So the 9 steps, and all of these steps are informed to a greater or lesser extent by positive psychology research. The first one is being honest with ourselves about how we are. One of the things that's unique to school leadership is we have to be uber compelling to everybody every single day. So we have to walk around our school with a smile on our face, and we have to, everything's under control and everything's brilliant, and we're swan-like in our ability to project calm and to be calm for the people around us. However, underneath the water, our swan feet are paddling away furiously, dealing with all of the myriad of things that we have to deal with. And if we're not careful, we can allow our, what we call the cloak of invincibility that we have to wear to be a compelling leader. We can allow that to overtake us, and that stops us from putting our hand up and going, actually, do you know what, I'm struggling a little bit today. So this notion of being honest with ourselves is really, really important starting point for the support that we put in place. Recognizing the need is all about the fact that you as school leaders, as I'm sure it's the same in India as it is in England, you give of yourselves endlessly to your children and your staff and your communities. And if we don't refill our own cup, we can't keep giving of ourselves if we're just pouring. You cannot pour from an empty cup is one of the statements that we use. So it's really important that we look after our leaders so they can continue to look after everybody else. Identify the barriers. So what's stopping you from looking after yourself really effectively is one of the things that we help with. We talk about amplifying the things that bring you joy. So what is it in your life that refills your cup, and can you do more of that, and can we help you to do that? This notion of building a positive self-image, you're doing an amazing job. Okay, can we help you to build that positive self-image about yourself, that you are doing an amazing job? So we focus on that. We focus on the impact of the fact that you're doing an amazing job. We do that through something called inspirational moments, helping you to identify the things that are inspiring and really resonate with you. And then we help you to focus on your skills and also to acknowledge your experience. It's often the case that school leaders are quite humble. They don't like talking about how good they are at stuff. They don't like talking about their skill set. They don't like talking about the experience that they've got, but we help you to do that. And then most importantly, and underpinning nearly everything we do, is this notion of reconnecting with purpose. We use a Japanese philosophy called ikigai, and ikigai translates roughly as your reason for being. And the reason why is because we know that people who are very purposeful and have a strong connection with their purpose in life also have a very high level of well-being. And then finally, we nurture connections and build support networks. So we help leaders to do that. So that's what our intentional support looks like. Just very briefly about the Heads Up for Head Teachers community. It is a national community. You can all join it from India. It's an international community in that regard. You can do that through the website link that is there. I'm not going to dwell on that slide. We also do inspirational and nourishing events through the Heads Up for Head Teachers, because we recognize the importance of inspiring school leaders, pouring fuel on the fire in their belly about education and the job that they do and the importance of it. And we also offer coaching. So just to wrap this section up before I hand back to Maya, I just want to talk a little bit about the support, or the elements of support that we are suggesting, working in partnership with TTF over and launching in India. And this echoes what we do in the English education system. So there are 3 elements to the support that we think are really, really important. And that's an important point to make. If we're going to be intentional about support, it can't just be one thing and a tick and a box that we've ticked. Oh, yes, they get support. We have to look at it as layers of support. And that's very much the approach that we take as partnership organizations at Core Coaching Group International and Heads Up for Teachers. So the elements of the support, what would they look like if we were to launch it in India with some of you? What would that look like? Well, it would be based on Heads Up for Head Teachers peer support sessions that I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. It would be based upon Core Coaching Group International's core coaching training, which I will talk about in a second. And it would be underpinned by coaching and coaching each other, which would result from the first 2. What does the Heads Up for Head Teachers peer support look like? Well, the way that we achieve intentionality and sustainability is outlined on the bullet points on the screen. So we would facilitate using the facilitators and the coaches that we have in our network. We would facilitate with you 6 weeks of Heads Up for Head Teachers facilitated peer support sessions. That's in groups of up to 15 people. We think that's really important, that 15 people collaborating and working together becomes a really effective peer support network moving forward. During that 6 weeks, we share the 9 steps that I've already talked about, but we would then focus on the culture within the group. So one of peer support, psychologically safe spaces, which are really important, but also peer celebration and helping people to reconnect with their purpose. It's important, as I said, that the groups are sustainable. So once we've taken you through that 6 weeks, we would then train you to be facilitators of your own group. So each group of 15 would be offered training. And that's where the sustainability comes from, because you can then continue to run your groups out as regularly and as often as you would like. So that's the Heads Up for Head Teachers peer support network. Let me talk to you a little bit about the core coaching model that we have developed. And I guess, like most coaching models, if you're familiar with coaching, like most coaching models, it breaks down into 4 areas. We call those context, optimize, refine, and enact. Possibly where it's a little bit different to most coaching models, which is the reason why it works from the point of view of sustainability. Most coaching models are very reliant upon the skill of the coach to operate in the spaces in between those 4 terms. And what we've done, again, using a large amount of positive psychology research to underpin it, is we've created a specific set of questions which sit in between context, optimize, refine, and enact. And what that means is we can train people to be really effective coaches in a very short space of time. The training takes roughly about 2 days, whereas most coaching models are reliant on weeks, if not months of training. And if you're talking about executive level training, indeed years of training. And our model, in terms of addressing intentionality and sustainability, we recognize that that's not available to everybody, and therefore there is an exclusivity to it. We want it to be inclusive. And because we want it to be inclusive, what we've done is we've filled in the gaps between those 4 words so that we can train people to be really quickly. So the model works broadly as it's outlined on the screen. It's an exploration of self-reflection and identification of personal strength. That's the starting point for it. We facilitate that with the use of Lego serious play, and the facilitators and coaches within the core coaching group community are experts in using Lego serious play. It's great fun, but it's really powerful and impactful. And we also use the VIA character strength survey to help people identify what their strengths are. And then once we've done that piece of work during the training, we then train you specifically in the use of the core coaching model. And that enables us to build peer-to-peer coaching networks, so you can offer each other one-to-one coaching. You don't have to go and seek coaching from something else. What that does is reduce the costs right down, because you don't have to pay an external coach. You can come up with individual agreements, and the only cost that each person in the relationship has is their own time. In terms of the outcomes of the core coaching training, what we tend to find when we survey the people who've gone through the training, we get sorry, just getting a bit of background noise. If somebody could mute, that would be appreciated. Thank you. So in terms of the training outcomes, we get an improved sense of self-worth, purpose, adaptability, and awareness. So that ties very much to the peer support work that we do at Heads Up for Head Teachers. What we see with the teams that we work with is we get higher performing individuals and teams, and that's one of the big impacts that we get from the core coaching model. We get much stronger, emotionally strong and stable teams. So working together in that emotional space creates a much greater sense of emotional strength tied to this notion of shared purpose. And we get an improved application of what we call moral courage, so the ability to do the difficult things in our job. And we get more effective individuals, leading to more effective and productive teams as a consequence. So you can see, hopefully, how the relationship between core coaching group and the National Heads Up works. One's operating up here at a peer support level, creating spaces where people can talk about the things that they're grappling with and the things that they're working through. And then the core coaching, at a layer down, the core coaching model is much more specific in terms of providing spaces for people to tackle individual issues that they are facing, but it's done through this notion of group and collective training. In terms of impact, this is very much from the Heads Up for Head Teachers. So I talked earlier on about 3,500 head teachers that we have worked with within the English education system. And we don't keep a lot of metrics at Heads Up for Head Teachers, but this is the most important one for us. It is literally 100% of the head teachers that we have worked with would recommend the peer support program to another head teacher. That's not a rounded up number. We have yet to take any single individual through this process and not have them come back to us and say, it's been impactful and it's really made a difference for me. And you've got quotes, we've got hundreds, if not thousands of anecdotal quotes like this, but you've got a couple of quotes on the screen there. So you can see the quotes that people are responding with in terms of the impact that it's had on them individually. That's the end of the presentation. I've not been following the chat, so I don't know if there are any questions, but I will hand back to Maya and Manila, and I'm happy to sort of take questions from people. I say I'm really interested to see whether any of the work that we've done has resonated in terms of some of the things that I've said. I'd be interested to have a conversation about that, but if people have got questions, I'm happy to take them there. Maya, back over to you.
Thanks, James. That was a really power-packed presentation. Very, very brief, but so much packed into it. There are a few questions which we've got, and I'm requesting all the participants to post some questions on chat also. So one question, in a way, you've answered in your presentation was, what do principals, we call head teachers principals here, what do principals need in order to feel supported? In a way, you did mention, especially in the core coaching model, but do you want to respond any more beyond what you've already presented? What do principals need to feel supported?
Yes, I think one of the things that we've learned through the core community and the heads up community is actually that sense of connection to other people who are doing the same job as them. It's really, really important, which is why we focus so much on networks. I think, and it's partly addressing the point about isolation. It can be really easy in the world that we operate for head teachers or principals to feel as if it's just them. It's just them that's feeling like this, and there aren't many spaces. It's very difficult to share that with people who are above you in your organization, trustees or boards of governors, and indeed people who are below you in your organization, because it can feel as if it's a little bit of an admission of failure. So what we do is, by creating the connection to other head teachers who share the same job and principals who share the same job, so understand what the job is like, that what we tend to find is that creates a space where people start to feel less isolated and more connected around a similar set of issues that people are facing. So that would be, there's lots of other things, but that would be my one key response to that question.
Thanks, James. Sorry, there's some drilling outside, so apologies for any noise that's coming from my side. Another question that's come up is, how can school heads foster a culture of emotional well-being amongst the teaching community? Because, of course, the onus is on the head, but what's the role the head teacher plays for emotional well-being of the teaching community?
It's a really, really good question. And I guess I would use the phrase, I'm always careful using this phrase, I'd use the phrase unintended consequences of the work that we do. So although we focus on head teachers, what was an unintended consequence is now a much more intentional one, is what we tend to find is, so one of the phrases we used to use is, if we don't get the head's head right, I translate that for India, if we don't get the principal's head right, how can we get successful cultures of well-being in a community? And you made the point earlier on, or Manila did, about principals being left till last. So we talk about SEL and well-being for young people, and we talk about it for staff within our schools. And often the head teacher is left out of that. Our approach is the other way around. We say, oh, actually, if we can get the head or the principal into the right space, that will automatically, because the principal is understanding the drivers for well-being much better themselves, that starts to create a trickle-down effect to everybody in their organization. So what we tend to find in the schools with the leaders that we're working with, and this echoes both the work that CORE does and the work of Heads Up, is because the leader is in a much better space, they can then take some of the strategies that we shared with them and they trickle down into their community. So the 9 steps, for example, not only do they, if I take one of the examples, I talk about inspirational moments. So we do inspirational moments with head teachers. But what we tend to find is those head teachers then start doing inspirational moments with the staff in their schools. So talk to me about something fantastic that you've seen today, which is going to lift your spirits and make you feel positive. And the same happens with the core coaching. Once we've connected head teachers into core coaching communities, they quite often then come back to us and go, can you create a network of core coaching within our school? So that if we start with the heads, we then open the door for better cultures of well-being in the principals and in the schools that the principals and head teachers are working in.
Well, Dr. Purnima Joshila in our group says, by default, does the co-coaching model take into consideration the context of the heads and the environment that they're in?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the work that we do in both organizations does exactly that. So it's down to the individual to bring their context to the table. The core coaching training will do that anyway. It's really, really powerful through the positive psychology tools that we use. It does that anyway. But then, of course, it gets much more specific after that. When people start to use the core coaching model to coach each other, they can bring specific issues that they are grappling with within their context and their environment and talk those through with each other. So you almost get a bit of a double hit. Through the training, you can talk about the things that you're grappling with. But then when you start coaching each other using the core model, you can actually talk through the things that are specific to you as a leader.
Yeah. We have another question. Thanks, James. We have another question here. While catering to SEL for head teachers or teachers, it becomes very difficult to draw a line between personal and professional well-being. Is there any way to find the gray area? I think it's a case of well-being. I don't think you can separate personal and professional, but what do you feel?
It's a great question. And I guess the way that we've dealt with that is actually we jump into the gray area. Because one of the things, and again, I'd be interested, this is the same for principals in India, but one of the things that we find for head teachers in England is actually that the higher up the leadership hierarchy you go to the point at which you become a head, when you're a deputy head teacher or an assistant head teacher or deputy principal or assistant principal, you can keep that separation between the professional you and the personal you a bit clearer. But actually, the reality of being a school leader is it's a reflection of who you are as a human being. As a school leader, you bring your values to the table. You bring your heart to the table. So what we tend to find is with head teachers, you've got this complicated crossover between the personal you. If something goes wrong in your school, it feels personal. It hurts you here, not just here. And so we kind of jump into the grey area, actually, and say, because one of the things that we're focusing on is I guess by asking principals and head teachers to take their cloak of invincibility off, we're exposing the human leader. And actually, you lead as a human being first, you lead as a professional second. And so we're very much focused on making sure that we're leading as human beings. And that's where we get into the grey area. So actually, the work that we do supports both the personal you and the professional you.
I like what you said, taking off that cloak of invincibility. Yes, it is about, being vulnerable, allowing yourself to fail. In fact, there's a question from Dhananjay on chat. The worry of failing prevents starting something new. How do you come out of it?
Yeah, and again, it's a really great. I mean, these are really interesting points because this is exactly the sort of stuff that head teachers in England say to us. So if you remember earlier on, I talked about the need to be swan-like. So you have to be compelling, but you also want to be self-reflective and vulnerable and human. And there are two issues that we see in the English education system. We see leaders who do this. So they become uber compelling and they lose all of their sense of human vulnerability. We call them superhero leaders, and they're not helpful. And then the other thing that we see is people who lose all sense of being compelling and they become super vulnerable and their imposter syndrome is off the charts.
Yeah.
It's really important for school leaders that we bring those two things into balance. You don't want to lose either of them, but you need to keep them in balance with each other. And so actually the point about failing is a really interesting one, because we only worry about failing if we're worried that there is a high stakes accountability result or impact of that failure. And
Absolutely.
So what we do is we get into a space of much more proactive and positive sort of human risk taking. And so that gets addressed through the training that we take, because actually, if we fail trying to do something that's really important and purposeful for our community, that's not a failure. That's just something to learn from.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said. I think I've just had a time check. We've run out of time. I really want to say thank you to James. I think you've packed in quite a bit into this very short 45 minutes or so. But a big thanks to James as well as his team at HeadsUp4HTs.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maya.